Welcome, everybody, to our distinguished webinar series on artificial intelligence and cybersecurity. Today's talk is on risk management and cybersecurity policy in the electric sector, featuring Annabelle Lee, Chief Cybersecurity Specialist at Nevermore Security. Annabelle Lee's experience comprises 40 years of technical experience in information technology system design and implementation, 15 years of operational technology cybersecurity for the electric sector, and 30 years of cybersecurity design, specification development, and testing. She's authored or co-authored many documents on cybersecurity, cryptography, and testing. She's a consultant focusing on cybersecurity for the energy sector, and her areas of expertise include cybersecurity strategy and risk management, design and architecture, specification, guidance, and requirements development, assessments against standards, training, and applied cryptography. Annabelle, it's a pleasure to have you contribute to our webinar series. And with that, the floor is yours.
I've done enough work with different organizations where people have assumed one thing on cryptography and what was being implemented, and it was inaccurate. And that I get very sensitive about that. So again, this is the practical side of cybersecurity. Okay, and as you see the diagram at the top, believe me, that's a lot of, what's going on, and people are looking around, they have no idea. Now, particularly in the OT environment, which is the operational technology, and that's in our critical infrastructures. As I said, I focus on the electric sector, but if you look at water, transportation, those are all critical infrastructures. There's being deployed digital technology in all of these critical infrastructures and advances in network technology. The different devices are being linked, and the OT side is being connected to the IT side. The attack that was done a couple of years ago on the petroleum, the people there conducted tabletop exercises. They had never included cyber in their tabletop exercise. They decided after that, gee, maybe they ought to include cyber in that. The difficulty with OT environment is there's really limited situational awareness, and I'll explain a little more why in a couple of slides. New risk. With everything being interconnected, there's an increased number of entry points and entry paths, either directly or from the IT side. I worked with a very large utility in Canada, and they were upgrading their system, huge system. And I asked them, and they had all kinds of firewalls, DMZs. I said, how do you link your legacy devices? And I won't say the four-letter word they said. They hadn't even thought about it. So that's one of the issues. If you have legacy devices, how do you protect those? Now, and we call this as bricking. And what that means in the OT environment is that the device stops working. And literally then, particularly in the electric sector, what that means potentially is that somebody has to go out to the substation, whether it's a distribution or transmission substation, and reconfigure the device and start it up. Obviously, that could get to be very expensive and very time consuming. And in the meantime, potentially, you have no electricity. So that's why in these devices, as I say, they're deterministic. And this is why the environment is very reticent to deploy new technology. You will see in my slides, I do not reference AI, ML. I think most of it is ML. I don't think it's AI or cloud deployment, because of the concerns of what could happen if something goes wrong. Okay. Larger attack surface, and again, security policies, they may apply in the IT environment, but not in the OT side. And with the political environment, and you hear this now, you hear Congress is very concerned about malicious threat actors, nation states. If you look at from the ransomware side, and again, that's more on the IT side, one of the largest users of ransomware to get funding is North Korea. I'm sure you hear about that. They are one of the most prominent in getting funding. Attacks are easier to launch. You can go to websites and download attack tools, attack vectors. And then again, with the OT side, you have the potential loss of service and loss of life. It was not a cyber attack, but look what happened in Texas. It was about 2.5 years ago, where they had that extreme weather and people lost their life. So this is why in the OT environment, there is significant concern and reticence to use new technology and tools. Okay, and some of this may be repeat, but I figured I would go over it so we could all be basically on the same page on this. For IT, the major objective typically is confidentiality, then you have integrity and availability. On the OT side, number one is availability. And if the security controls, security measures impact availability, believe me, they will not get deployed. Second is integrity. Third is confidentiality. Now, the one exception on confidentiality being the lowest is the smart meters and your meter data. Now, for smart meters, if you didn't know, the privacy laws in the United States, we are not like Europe, and I've worked all over Europe and with a lot of European utilities and Eastern European utilities. They have the GDPR, which is General Data Protection Requirements, that applies across the EU. In the United States, I keep saying I got to look up the number one of these days. I think we have 47 or 48 different privacy laws. Every state has their own privacy laws. And what this means from a practical perspective is the state determines who owns your usage data, whether it's you, whether it's the utility, whether you are able to sell back electricity to the utility. All of that is defined at the state level. Needless to say, it makes it very difficult. And when you have large utilities, such as First Energy, Southern, that cross multiple states, they have to be careful about the laws, particularly the privacy laws in each of the states. Differences. I take that back. I think what I'll do is after a couple of slides, I'll stop and see if there are any questions. When you look at the OT environment, there are specific controls that are not appropriate for control systems. You do not terminate sessions. If somebody's on, if the system is functioning, you leave it operational. If you do that in an OT device, again, you may shut down electricity. The life cycle for IT is 6 months to 2 years. Control systems, it's 15 to 40 years. That means you have devices out there that are 30 to 40, and some of them older than that, years. Part of the reason is if you look at the big transformers and generators, the lead time is at least 2 years. They are not made in the United States, and they are millions and millions of dollars. And I've heard discussions on the news about congressional hearings that, gee, they would like to have utilities have backup transformers and generators. Utilities can't afford that. It's just millions of dollars. And most people now have smart meters. And I've asked before, how long do you think that smart meter will be on your home? And general comment is 3 years. Believe me, it's going to be there probably for 15 years. So if you think about the change in technology over just even a 15-year period, it's significant. A lot of the devices have limited bandwidth and processing capabilities. If you look at the communication protocols that are deployed in substations, they are very, very old. They work, so they don't get changed. And again, there's a potential loss of life if there's a compromise. So very different environment. In IT, delays are acceptable. I think most of us are happy if our email goes down for a little while. For control systems, due to safety, any delay, any latency is not acceptable. And again, that impacts then what they deploy on the devices. Antivirus, when the new technology, well, IT technology, and I would say this is probably 10, 12 years ago, was first deployed at utility substations. People thought it was a great idea to run antivirus and anti-malware code on these IT devices. You can't do that. It impacts the availability and operations of those devices. And so when I first got into the OT environment, I was at Homeland Security, and boy, I got beat up big time. People said, you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't do this. And again, if you look at the potential impact, that is why a number of these IT controls you don't put on control systems, even if the control system, the underlying device is an IT device. Okay, as I said, that what this does is it means there are a lot of challenges. The endpoints, they don't have a lot of computation. If you look at sensors, and now they're becoming more, IT capable, they have more processing capacity, but still they may be constrained in what they can do in storage. Some of these really old devices don't have firmware software upgrade capability. They're 30, 40 years old, they don't have that. And the endpoints are bandwidth constrained. As I said before, if you look at the communication protocols, DMP3, Modbus, believe me, you can't transmit a lot of data. The endpoints are physically exposed and cannot be physically secured. Look at your meters. They're on the outside of your house. If you look at transformers in a home area, the transformer may be on a power line or it may be on the ground. So you cannot physically secure all those devices. I have been in meetings where people said, well, gee, why don't you do that? It would cost millions and millions of dollars. And so no, utilities can't do that. System patching. If you look at these old devices, the OS may no longer be supported. That is a problem, not only in the electric sector, but in other critical infrastructures. I was flying a couple of years ago and I couldn't believe the operating system they were using. I was floored. Patching can cause a reboot. And as I said before, if these devices are operating in the environment, you can't just reboot them because that could impact the operation of the system. And significant user acceptance requirements to patch a system. People say, well, you've got your Patch Tuesday with Microsoft. When you look at the OT environment, it could be 6 months to 2 years before they deploy a patch because they need to make sure it does not impact the operational environment. Okay, electric sector, I've talked a little bit about this. The environments are not the same when you look at the OT side and the business side. OT systems must be able to survive a cyber incident. This is a huge issue. I talk about, when I talk to utilities, of operating in degraded mode, and generally they cringe. This is really difficult, but again, if you look at the environment, they need to operate. Latency is unacceptable. I will say that over and over again. For most of these devices and systems in substations, latency is a real issue, and they must operate 24/7. The electric sector is not the only one. You have the water sector, transportation, so on. They have to function 24/7. You cannot take down let's say a substation. You may be able to take down one substation, but you just can't take down multiple substations and tell people, sorry, you don't have electricity. And I know there's one exception. California has done that more than once. with the heat and everything, but generally utilities do not take down multiple substations. And then again, OT components don't have the processing capacity to support cybersecurity. So you have to address cybersecurity other ways. You may do it at the boundary of the substation and have a firewall, and then firewall and DMZ at the head end or the control center. And OT components are publicly accessible areas. As I mentioned, your meters, transformers, some generators, they're out in the open. And even the larger power lines, if you look at those, are all out in the open. So they are subject to physical tampering. Okay, let me just stop there and see. I'll give people a chance. Are there questions, comments?
We have one.
Oh, there's one in the Q&A.
Yep.
Oh, quantitatively assess risk. Oh, I have a quantitative slide. Okay. To me, the difficulty, and I statistician by training, I like the metric side of it. The difficulty, to me, one of the big difficulties with quantifying risk is, let's say you've associating that with cost and so on. Let's say you're a large utility, you have deployed firewalls, DMZ, security controls, and so on. And you were trying to explain to your board and senior management that this is a valuable resource, okay, that you've done a good job. In this environment, the attacks aren't always reduced. The impact may be mitigated, but you don't always reduce the impact. So how do you tell people, yes, we've spent a lot of money, but we're still being attacked? I think, to me, that's a huge problem. And when you attempt to quantify risk, and I worked with one utility, they did their risk assessment, and I think they had it down to 6 decimal points. What does that mean? I mean, 4 decimal points, 5 decimal points, if it's 0.00004 or 0.00005, what is the difference? I have difficulties, and I know you want to do things quantitatively, but tell me the difference even at one level between a 6 and a 7. I don't know how to do that. So sorry, I don't have a good answer for you on that one. Oop. Whoa. Let me close that out. So I talk a little bit about metrics, but like I say, and I've worked on it. I've seen people try to come up with metrics. I don't know good ones. I have an approach of how to do it a little later. Sorry. Any other questions?
Looks like that's it.
Okay, attack surface. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the attack surface is huge. Now, this is where an attacker can get into a system. And if you just look at all these interconnected devices and systems, you have a larger attack surface. And that gives you more opportunities to attack a system. The attack vector is a specific method or path that an attacker uses. Okay, social engineering, believe me, that works very well. If you look at and if you read the reports, a lot of the attacks are launched via social engineering. You know, they compromise people's email, people click on attachments they shouldn't. That is still one of the most common ways of getting into systems. One of the big compromises, I think it was the meat packing. I forget whether it was the meat packing or the oil company. They got in using somebody's account, and that person hadn't worked for the company for about 3 years. You know, I mean, they're basic things you need to do. The attack surface, as I said, with IoT and IoT, it's larger. Threat agents, I mentioned this before. This list changes. People, you know, these are the basic categories, but some have focus on others. The biggest one, I think now that's obviously of concern of the US is the government and nation states. If you look at Russia, if you look at China, they are well funded. I get threat information every day, and the amount of attacks that they launch, not only against the US, but Europe, South America. You know, ransomware is a huge problem now all around the world. Organized crime, you know, they are in some of these nation states, they are funded. Hacktivists, those are just the ones who want to, gee, for my cause. Insiders, disgruntled employees, sometimes that's the way they go through. Internal user error, they are a threat agent. They are not malicious, but if people make mistakes. Now, when all of the airlines were shut down, what was that, about a month ago? The bottom line on that was they were upgrading the one system. It was a really old system, and I think they deleted a couple of applications. And that's why the system, you know, that's why that huge system shut down. That wasn't malicious, but potentially it could have the same impact. Okay, previously, and I think this is more in the IT environment, the approach is to be reactive, you know, protection and detection. The problem is you're always playing catch up, and particularly now. So what people are doing is trying to augment this defensive paradigm. Consider cybersecurity from the attacker's perspective. Think like an attacker. You know, what would they like to exfiltrate from your system? You know, this is the old joke about if I'm in the mountains, and we do have them around here, bears. I don't need to outrun the bear. I just need to outrun you. Well, the issue with, from the attacker's perspective, make your organization a less friendly target that they go after somebody else. I mean, that's one way of doing it. What you want to do, and then, as I say, define a high-level mitigation strategy independent of the specific IT/OT device. You have to start at the very top level, and I'll get into that more in a little while. Increase the cost to the adversary. If attacking your system is very, very expensive, they'll go somewhere else and do active defense. That does not mean you can just go out and launch attacks, but it means do active defense. Okay, I'm going to get into risk management and risk assessment, and I've got a number of diagrams here. These are samples. They're not intended to be the only way you could do things, but I think it makes it easier to understand what's going on. A cybersecurity program is composed of many items. You see here, you have policies and regulations. As I mentioned, you have state privacy laws, there are federal laws that different organizations. This applies to both the IT and the OT side. And then you have the enterprise, what their vision, mission, objectives are. And out of that comes a cybersecurity strategy that applies across the organization. And then you also have the cybersecurity vision, mission, and strategic objectives. And you develop a roadmap. Now, obviously, roadmaps need to be updated regularly. with the change in technology, and particularly with the new AI/ML coming out tools. And then you do a risk management framework and a risk assessment. So you start at a very high level and then go down to the lower levels. These are not static. Things get updated regularly. You need to keep current with not only change in technology, but the environment. Okay, the overall strategy, vision and mission, as I said, are at a high level. You don't change those frequently. The vision is the aspiration and mission is the core purposes of the organization. Some people may use a little different terms, but I think these are generally understood as the what you include for the organization. And these really are at such a high level, they're only changed for significant changes such as technology, cyber attacks. I think AI, ML are two. Another one is the potential for quantum computing. I am working on a quantum key distribution research project. I think eventually when quantum computing becomes a reality, that's going to have a significant impact on all of the systems. Objective provides guidance. And then program activities, those are the very detailed, and you need to update those regularly. Okay, the strategy. That should include high priority activities. You cannot solve all of your cybersecurity problems. You have to prioritize. Nobody can afford it. Also, it would adversely impact the operation of the systems. Before I went out on my own, I worked at the Electric Power Research Institute, and we had biannual meetings with all of our utilities. One utility got up and they were talking about work they were doing with EPRI, and they wanted to share certain information, and they said they finally gave up because of all the cybersecurity issues, and that drives me nuts. I mean, you have to have the capability of doing things with cybersecurity. That's what I say, it's messy. You have to figure out how to do it. Objectives and activities will pursued over the next 5 years. Now with the change in technology and everything, you may do your top level ones in 1 to 3 years. Assumptions, as I say, achieving 100% security is not possible. That's a totally unrealistic goal. Resources are limited, and all systems cannot and should not be protected in the same manner. Again, if you look at the OT devices, you are not going to deploy cybersecurity controls in a number of those OT-specific devices at substation. Risk-based methods should be used to make decisions and prioritize. Those have to be balanced against the business needs of the organizations. Energy delivery systems, they must perform critical functions during and after attack. That is a real problem with utilities. You know, because if you look at devices that are 40 years old, they never had security, nobody worried about it, and now they have to be concerned. And cybersecurity cannot interfere with the energy delivery functions. Okay, and you'll see, and I have a reference list at the end there. There are several really good documents you can use if you are developing a strategy, if you're doing a risk management, et cetera. Don't figure you have to reinvent the wheel. There's a lot out there you can use. I like this. ENISA is the European Union Network and Information Security Agency. They keep changing the name a bit. They produce a number of really excellent documents. They are funded by the EU. I've worked with them probably for 10, 15 years. I was on an EU task force a number of years ago where we were looking at cybersecurity and looking at the NIS directive for the EU. So they have a lot of very good material out there that you can use. Policies, you develop the strategy, execute, Evaluate, monitor. As you can see, none of these are, you do it once and then just leave it. You have to monitor it. Are there changes? Has your system been attacked? As I said with the petroleum, gee, they hadn't done tabletop exercises, okay? That means you need to change what you're doing. And I think this is one reason that organizations get a bit frustrated with cybersecurity. You know, they look at the other functions. If you look at a number of the business functions, once those are implemented, they may have to make changes and updates infrequently, but cybersecurity is different. You constantly have to monitor what is going on in the environment and make changes. And again, that's very frustrating to a lot of organizations, because if you're going to do cybersecurity effectively, it's also not free. Okay, governance framework, which is really, as I say, at the top here, implementation, evaluation, and maintenance of the cybersecurity strategy. Define roles and responsibilities. When I was at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, I was one of the people that went out and accredited laboratories, crypto testing laboratories. And one of the amazing things is, okay, they'd have a list of who was supposed to do what. They never updated it. And you'd look at the list and ask about the, oh, gee, they don't work here anymore. They have a different responsibility. You've got to keep those updated. And look at your maturity. Where are you? What have you done? Develop a security architecture. I am a huge fan of doing architectures. A lot of people grumble about it, but just my example earlier of the diagram that the utility did where they showed the connection of all the new devices, and they forgot to include legacy devices. Doing an architecture is an excellent way to see where you are and where you want to go. Do a threat assessment. What are the main ones you're concerned about? In the electric sector, large utilities definitely worry about nation states. Smaller utilities do not. That does not mean that smaller utilities should avoid cybersecurity. At one of the EPRI meetings, one small utility, the lead said, gee, we just, we're small. Why would anybody be interested in attacking us? And I looked at the person in charge. I said, thank you very much. I can attack your system and use you as my basically jump off point for going after larger systems. They hadn't even thought about it. So, everybody has to worry about it. Smaller utilities, I've worked with some that they do things in Excel spreadsheets. That's fine. But they do address cybersecurity. Identify your critical systems and assets. Again, you can't spend lots of money on all of the systems. If you tried to, the systems wouldn't function. Do a risk assessment and a roadmap. Metrics, key performance indicators, KPIs. Agreed, metrics are a tough one. Okay, these are sort of metrics. Yeah, reliability and resiliency. Cybersecurity is not done independent of the operational environment. You have to look at it from the perspective, okay, is what am I getting out of cybersecurity? Reliability and resilience. And that it applies to both the IT and the OT side. Reliability, these are mentioned here, are specific to the electric sector, meeting the demand, withstanding sudden disturbances, and resilience, lessening the likelihood of outages, limiting the impact, restoring power and learning. You need a defense in depth approach, zoned architecture, and I think most organizations now are realizing, yes, you have to segregate the IT and the OT, and even within the IT or OT environment, you segregate. You don't have a flat network that everybody can access everything. Multi-layer approach, and go from there. Okay, let me just stop. I'll take another short break. Any other questions, comments? You're all too
I have
quiet.
I have one.
Yeah,
Kind of long-winded, but the trend for substations seems to be towards IEC 61850 Ethernet Wi-Fi based networks, which are more
yeah.
traditional in IT networks. And you mentioned legacy system integration, and I'm wondering, first, to what extent would you expect to find legacy hardware and software in a typical IEC 61850 substation? And two, is there any hesitancy from electric companies towards adopting this, like, traditionally IT software and hardware?
Yeah, IEC 61850 is used throughout Europe. It's not used that much in the United States. I know a couple utilities were testing against it. I don't know of any that are actively looking at IEC 61850. That's just not, it's a European standard.
You don't know of any in America?
No, I
Okay.
was trying to think. I know one, I know at least one that's experimenting with it, but most of them don't use it. They use Modbus and DNP3, which
Okay.
is, it's terrible ones. No, it's, again, that's used more throughout Europe. Europe, if you look at Europe and the transmission side, as opposed to the distribution side of the electricity sector, transmission in Europe, there's across EU, I forget the name of the group, but they really coordinate across. US doesn't. Our states, I mean, there are regions and so on, but there really is not a lot of detailed coordination.
Okay.
So, yeah, it would be nice if people use things like IEC 61850. The issue with the legacy, those devices work, they're going to leave them there. And probably a lot of those legacy devices, you couldn't put IEC 61850 in them. You couldn't deploy it.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, risk management. And again, these are not meant to be, gee, this is the only way you can do it, but it's just, it'll give you an idea. At the high level, the risk management process and strategy, you have different types of risk. You have financial risk, cybersecurity risk, and mission risk. So all of those feed into the enterprise's process and strategy. They are not independent of each other. Out of the cybersecurity risk, you have your risk assessment methodology, and you have under that control-based, maturity model-based, and compliance-based. Let me explain those. Control-based is looking at a specific standard and saying, do we meet those requirements? It could be NIST Special Publication 853. It could be any of the other ones that define specific controls. You select the ones at the level at the CIA level, low, moderate, high, and you pick your controls. Maturity models are tools such as the DOE Cybersecurity Capability Maturity Model. It was developed at DOE. I was one of the authors of the several versions of it. You can use it across different critical infrastructures, and that helps you determine where you are from a maturity perspective. Compliance methodology in the US and the electric sector specifically is the North American Electric Reliability Corporation Critical Infrastructure Protection Standards, which is why we say NERC CIPS. That is a baseline NERC, and then the federal organization, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which gives authority to NERC. They will tell you that if you meet the NERC CIPS, that does not mean your system is secure. Okay, but those are just kind of different approaches you can look at when you're figuring out your risk management, risk assessment, and the controls, and it applies against the IT and the OT system. Europe has their own set, as I mentioned, that the GDPR, they have the NIS directive, they do use IEC 61850. They have their own standards that they use. Now, there's one example. This is another one that the Dragos has developed for their risk management process, where they do the risk characterization, threat evaluation, impact, risk evaluation, treatment, monitoring, and communication. Even though the words may be a little different, the content and what you do from a risk management perspective is pretty similar. You know, it's the different steps are very similar. Okay, risk management, prioritize. Whoops, sorry. You need to prioritize, absolutely. Cost effectiveness, feasibility, and potential for risk reduction. What drives the OT environment crazy is that they'll get these frantic notices, oh, there's this malware, or you need to protect against this. It may not even be applicable to the OT environments, or even if it's the malware is installed on a device in the OT environment, you may not be able to do anything with it. So you really need to be careful. Deter, disrupt, prepare. Yeah, I see I need to hurry up a little bit. Reduce the vulnerability. Again, you just don't want your major functional systems to be attacked. Mitigate, enable timely and focused attention on prevention, protection, mitigation, response, and recover, not only on vulnerability reduction. And this is from the NIP, which is the National Infrastructure Protection Plan tool published by DHS. It's still a nice tool. Again, there are lots of tools out there and guidance documents. Don't think you have to reinvent the wheel, do your own. Now, and this is what you do when you do risk. You look at the different standards and best practices, measures that work. You know, if you have colleagues that say, gee, we tried this, it was work, do exercises. I really push that. As I said, tabletop exercises are very effective. The cost, if you're interested in a solution that costs more than what you spend an entire year on cybersecurity, it's not useful, even if it's a great solution. When I was working in Eastern Europe with a lot of utilities, one of the utilities was talking about what they had deployed, and one of the people from another utility said, why didn't you use this tool? And the guy was very blunt. He said that was more money than our annual budget. So, and also one option may be no action. Okay, so you need to think about all of that. Here's another diagram, again, just general for risk assessment. As I said earlier, these are not intended to be the only way you can do things, but the idea is to look at, you need to have a system architecture. As I said, I like diagrams. I get people roll their eyes at me, but believe me, you see a diagram, what's there and what's not there. It's very easy then to help you figure out where the boundaries are, where the major attack points are, an asset and system identification. And I've had people say, gee, well, the utility sector, do they really have all their assets identified? IT companies don't either. So it isn't just unique to critical infrastructures. It's hard to keep an updated asset inventory, but that obviously is very critical. You know, it's hard to figure out how things can get attacked if you don't know what's out there. You do a vulnerability assessment, impact, threat likelihood. Are they going to go after this? You determine risk. Again, that's typically more at a qualitative. You have to make decisions. Then you look at requirements and mitigation controls. And you have to look at cost and for the electric sector, also performance impact. You know, if it's impacts latency, you're not going to deploy it. This is just kind of the general. And then once the systems have been implemented, you have to update it. The vulnerabilities, the risk, the impact. Do you need additional controls? And again, you have to look at cost on all of these. But don't laugh at my diagrams. I'm not the world's best. Risk assessment. And then this is just a little more description of what's included in each of the steps and in the diagrams above. You need to look at hardware, software, firmware, data documentation, all of that supports the function, whatever function that you're looking at. Vulnerability, where are your vulnerabilities? And, you know, there's NIST has, you have a common vulnerability database there. Vendors post vulnerabilities. Look and see what's out there. If you look at now a number of the malware tools and attack vectors, it's amazing. The mitigation strategy for some of these has been out there for 1 or 2 years and people don't deploy it. You know, you need to look at all of that. Configuration management is a big issue. What is the baseline configuration of all of the devices? That includes the software and firmware on the devices, the communication protocols. You need to have a good configuration baseline, and that'll help you when you are doing your vulnerability assessment or looking at patching. Threat actors. What are the main ones that you're worried about? And again, look at the insider who may not be malicious, but may do something stupid. One of the big issues with utilities when they were first looking at cybersecurity, they would give all their field personnel basically administrative privileges so they could go out to a substation and they could do anything. That clearly is not an acceptable approach, because if somebody makes a mistake, they could impact the operation of the systems. Field personnel don't like it, but they have to be, you know, you have to think about what could happen if they just made an innocent mistake. What's the impact? You know, is it significant? Is it not significant? Okay, if the impact is minimal, do I really want to spend the resources, which means personnel and money, to mitigate whatever the impact could be? Threat likelihood. Okay, this is another one when you're looking at all of this. Here are some of the components. And again, these are not totally comprehensive lists. You can look and get a lot more details, but it helps you think about what you need to consider when you're doing a risk assessment. Okay. And the ones, as I said, availability tools and cost to exploit. Risk assessment, you do your risk determination, and then you decide, okay, which risks do I want to mitigate? And here, you can decide to mitigate, accept, transfer, or avoid. Those are options. You don't always have to mitigate every risk that's out there. The big one is the continuous monitoring. As I said earlier, you can't just do it once and then say, oh, good, we're okay, I don't need to do this again. You need to do it at regular intervals. And this can be, the interval can be determined by the importance of the specific system. I think number of organizations, they may do it annually. You know, you don't want to do it every month because you don't have the resources or personnel, but look at the systems. And when I talk about prioritization risk ranking, this is a very simple way to look at risk. And it's an easy way to present it to senior management as opposed to, well, this has a score of 6.55556, and this has a score of 6.587, something like that. You look at your impact and your likelihood. Lower right, you have 0, 0, which is low likelihood, low impact. On the right, high likelihood, low impact. Upper left, low likelihood, high impact. Upper right, high likelihood, high impact. Obviously, the ones you're going to address first are the high likelihood, high impact. And then the ones that you need to make a decision about is what's next, the upper left or the lower right. Yeah, that depends on the system. Now, when I worked at Homeland Security, people kept saying CBRNE, CBRNE, and I said, well, what's that? Chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear, and explosives. Even though the potential for impact is low likelihood, it's high impact. They mitigate those risks. Clearly, you don't want to have a nuclear event, even though the probability is very low. So you have to look at, the system and what the impact is. Okay, moving forward. So I said earlier, cybersecurity needs to support both reliability and resiliency. You need to address interconnected systems, and all of these systems are interconnected now. So deal with it. Continually assess, as I said earlier. There will be security breaches. That's the reality of our world. It may be on the IT side, hopefully not on the OT side. It is going to happen. People do dumb things. They click in emails that they shouldn't. Figure out how you're going to live in degraded mode. And that, as I said earlier, that's really critical for the OT environment. And look at response and recovery. Fail secure is the big thing in the OT environment where you're addressing safety and security. Safety is number one in most of the critical infrastructures. Because if you think about it, if somebody makes a mistake and you send a crew out to a substation and they assume that the electricity has been turned off and it hasn't been, you could kill somebody. So, safety is number one. Apply the IT lessons learned from, this is probably 40, 50 years now. Build security in, and I'm sure you all know people say, well, I'll do it later. That's not how you do it. That's not as effective, and it's a lot more expensive. When I say it's not as effective, it has more of an adverse impact on the performance of the systems, and it's definitely not as effective as building it in earlier. Okay, and then really my last one is, I mentioned there are a number of references. These are just some that I use that are really good. The CIS critical security controls. I forget what the number was. This is version 8. They keep updating that. The risk management, that's a Dragos document. SANS Industrial. SANS has a lot of good documents. There are two tools. I don't know if you've seen these. They're called the MITRE ATT&CK matrices. One's on enterprise and IPS that lists tactics, techniques, and procedure. Those are fantastic tools, used a lot now. They get updated regularly. I mentioned the C2M2. There's the Industrial Control System Cyber Kill Chain. That's another very useful one. The NIST Cybersecurity Framework. And then there's NIST 7628. These are all good reference documents. This is only just a small list. I mean, there really are a lot out there you can use. And then somebody sent me this one time and I like it. In case of cyber attack, break glass and pull cables. So any other questions, comments? Well, let me go on the Q&A
thank you.
and see. Oh, nope. Okay.
I see Arup has two questions. First, what are your thoughts on implementing zero trust principles with OT infrastructure?
On zero trust, and what was the other part?
Implementing zero trust principles with OT infrastructure.
I have reservations, again, because if you're really going to do a true zero trust architecture, which to me says when you perform or a device performs any task, they have to be authenticated. That's an issue in the OT environment. I mean, you given the latency issues, you probably can't do it. So I have real reservations about implementing zero trust in the OT side. And these are the OT devices that are at substations and so on. Yeah, that one, I have a problem with that.
Okay. And then his next question is also, what advice would you give to students who are looking to get into governance, risk, and compliance, GRC? Thank you for your insights.
Oh, governance, risk, and compliance. Okay, this depends on what you want to do. You know, if you want to go on the OT side, believe me, and I'm sure you all hear this, there's such a need, and this is international need for people in cybersecurity. I mean, the people aren't out there. And part of the issue is now some organizations are losing their cybersecurity support staff. People are getting burned out, you know, because they have to deal with so much. My personal opinion, and this is just from my experience, you know, I worked in the electric sector, I worked with law enforcement for 6 years. If you are going to be effective in a specific area, such as electric or wherever, you need to have an understanding of that environment. You can't just go in and say, well, I know cybersecurity and I don't know electricity, but this is what you need to do. You need to learn something about the environment where it's going to be deployed, because you could really make some errors. For example, when OT systems in the electric sector really started deploying IT devices like laptops and so on, and there would be cyber incidents, law enforcement and the FBI was going in and saying, well, okay, I want to take the laptop so I can study it. Well, and the people in the substation say, well, if you do that, my substation goes down. You know, you have to understand the details of the application where you're deploying the cybersecurity. I mean, other people may have other ideas, but that's my opinion. You need to know what the environment is, you know, and how you're going to do it. And that's getting into one of these companies that does it, you know, as opposed to the straight IT side. I like the OT side. You know, I did IT for a number of years, but I like working in the OT side. Any other questions?
It looks like that's it. And in the interest of time, we should probably wrap up this session. Thank you, Annabelle, for contributing to our webinar.
Hope that was useful. I hope it's useful. If you have follow-up, you know, people can send me follow-up questions. I've got my email down there.
Okay, thank you.